By profession, I'm a professor of law, and in some respect, that job is like that of a judge. You are supposed to be impartial, not to have any political prejudice, or if you have them, to set them aside, and to seek the truth and present the truth as you see it without the taint of your own preferences. That, of course, is impossible for a professor and is impossible for a judge. So it's better to be transparent about these things. I have spent 34 years of my professional life as a serious student of European integration, not only because it's an interesting topic, not only because it put bread on the table, but because I find it a noble experiment in social organization and political organization, unprecedented, and a cause which I sympathize with. Having said that, this does not mean that as a professor I should let that cloud my judgment or affect my assessment of the current situation, which I judge to be grave. There's a crisis in Europe, and I echo what President Maurice Cremona was saying, that is deeper than the Euro crisis. It is deeper than the Euro crisis and more significant than the Euro crisis because it conditions the ways in which we can deal with the Euro crisis. It limits our choices. It affects the abilities of politicians to act, and that is a legitimacy crisis. And I'll use a fad expression. We can talk about the burst of a legitimacy bubble. Why do I use the concept of bubble? If we talk about a property bubble, the market seems to be doing very well, to be prosperous, but in fact it is not such, and at a certain point it bursts to grave effect. For quite a while it seemed as if Europe enjoyed considerable popular legitimacy, but in fact that was not the case, and suddenly this bubble burst, and now our politicians and the political situation has to be faced with a significant lack of public support, which previously was taken for granted. What are the signs of this bursting of the bubble, of this legitimacy crisis? Since we have only 10 minutes, it's really the Twitter culture. So I will give you a series of tweets to try and encapsulate this. So number one, it's not only the very low turnout to elections to the European Parliament, but it is a decreasing turnout. From elections to elections, less and less people go and vote for the European Parliament. And one can talk a long time about it, but it is certainly not a sign of confidence in the principal institution, which is meant to be the vox populis. Second, it's good to debate Europe and to contest, and that is part of democratic life. But there's a strain of Euroscepticism which used to be in the past something that defined fringe parties, the lunatic left and the lunatic right. And that has now become much more mainstream. In many of our member states, we find important parties, part of whose political discourse is a kind of Euroscepticism which previously was associated with the extreme right and left. That kind of thing has become legitimated, and again, it's a sign of this legitimacy crisis that I'm talking about. Thirdly, there has been a worrying institutional failure, and I allude to something that Stefano Bartolini said a minute ago. At the height of the crisis, and it's not as if we're out of it, but people were not looking to see what the Commission would propose or what the European Parliament would propose or what even the Council of Ministers or the European Council would propose. Everybody was there listening. What would Ms. Merkel and Sarkozy, or today Merkel and Hollande, propose? Entirely outside the institutional framework of the institutions. And I give this as a sign because it was not towards the institutional leadership that one was looking to, but some important member states, and not even that, important figures in those member states. And finally, in a list that could go on, there's a solidarity crisis. And the sign of the solidarity crisis is that the debate is not merely should we have austerity or should we have growth policies, or what is the right balance between austerity and growth, but why should we Germans or we Dutch or we Finns help Italians, Spaniards and Greeks? That is a different type of question. It is not what one hoped for when at the height of our success and our confidence in the European construct. Now, the reasons for this. There are many reasons for this, but I will mention essentially three. The legitimacy of the European construct was overly based on results, what we call result legitimacy, and not sufficiently on process and on a legitimating narrative. In other words, the democratic processes of the European Union were deficient, continue to be deficient, and yet it didn't translate into legitimacy and support because the success of the European Union was so impressive. So if you can deliver results, and for decades the Union produced magnificent results, both political and economic, you don't have to worry about your process legitimacy. And the second source, or the third source of legitimacy of European integration was a compelling founding narrative, a historical narrative that captured the imagination of overcoming the mistakes of the past, of peace, of prosperity in a Europe that emerged from its worst, horrific carnage. And yet here Europe became a victim of its success because peace arrived and reconciliation between Germans and Frenchmen does no longer have a mobilizing force to a new generation. That doesn't give you any more legitimacy. So if you put all your eggs in the basket of success and suddenly success escapes you and you have weak process legitimacy, you face the crisis that we are facing today. Now, you might ask me, why do I say that the process legitimacy of Europe is weak? After all, we have a European Parliament which is a veritable co-legislator with the Council of Ministers and has significant powers, some of which some national parliaments do not have. And yet, though we should not make the mistake of comparing the European Union to a state, it is not a state, but we cannot avoid the exigencies of democratic legitimacy. We live in societies. Our credo is that the exercise of public power, no matter by whom, requires democratic legitimacy. And Europe has failed to date in its institutional arrangements to replicate at the European level two foundational features of democracy which in our member states we take for granted, and if we don't have them, we don't call it a democracy. The first is the principle of accountability, or what the British call, in that very felicitous phrase, the ability to throw the scoundrels out. You have governance, and if at a certain point the people don't like that governance, they can throw the scoundrels out. Europe is not a state, but we do have governance, and yet there is no mechanism to throw the scoundrels out. There's no moment on the calendar of the civic life of the Union where people can go to the polls, vote, and know they will change the government, or the equivalent of what we expect in our member states. And the second is the principle of representation. If there's a majority of voters who vote center-left, you expect to see that translated into policy, into legislation. If there's a majority that votes center-right, you expect to see that translated into preferences, into policies, into laws. And in Europe, that is simply not the case. It's not structured in that way. You can have a majority of voters to the European Parliament of the center-left or the center-right, and you cannot track that that impacts the political preferences of the Union. That's the principle of representation. So it shouldn't surprise us altogether that we have this legitimacy crisis when we are facing the euro crisis or the economic crisis of today, because so much was vested in success. And if success eludes us, then suddenly mobilization disappears. Now, what to be done? The first thing is to say Europe is too big to fail. And I don't mean it in the sense we say this bank is too big to fail. The European idea is too big to fail. The European ideal is too big to fail. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. It would be a defeat that goes well beyond things that are measured in the level of unemployment or growth, etc. So there's not going to be a blueprint now, this policy or that policies, but ways of thinking about it. The first thing is, and I echo what President Monti was saying, that alongside the concrete solutions that have to be found, and they will have to be found at a European level, to the economic crisis, there has to be a serious track and commitment to thinking about institutional and structural reform, to realize and acknowledge, even though it's an uncomfortable realization, that Lisbon did not do the trick. Lisbon, that in some ways emulated some of the thinking in the defunct constitution, did not do the trick. And that there has to be some additional serious, radical, bold, and brave moves if we really are to move away from a legitimacy which is based entirely on results and instead enhance process legitimacy and invent a new narrative that is compelling. Number two, in thinking about this project, we have to realize that the word democracy deficit is not a good proxy for our problems. It's political deficit. 1 minute. It's political deficit. And I know other speakers, including Miguel, will have ideas, and there are ideas on the table. It sounds a contradiction, but the union needs to be politicized. When people go and vote, they need to feel that they're making a real choice about the destiny of Europe. Will it go in this direction? Will it go in that direction? Third, it requires courage and statementships from our member state leaders. It's not enough to turn to the South and say, you have to show statesmanship and go against public opinion and impose austerity. The North also has to show statesmanship and go against public opinion and show solidarity. Here's another uncomfortable truth. The crisis today is the deepest we have had since the inception of the Union. It really threatens the European way of life. It's no less serious than Europe emerging in the late 40s and 50s. At that moment, European leaders didn't turn around and say, you made mistakes, now pay for them. They did not look to the past and allocate blame. They looked to the future and said, how do we do this together? And that spirit is needed today from North and South. And finally, thinking outside the box, thinking the unthinkable. Probably an instrument of democracy, no less important than voting, is taxing. It's my money that you're spending. I want accountability. Let's think in bold ways in those directions too. Thank you very much.